It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dame Catherine Wybourne, who's a prioress of the Holy Trinity Monastery at East Hendred. She's also called the Digital Nun, and you will know why, those of you who haven't met her or heard her before, in a minute. Dame Catherine read history at Cambridge. She did her PhD research in Spain, and then spent a few years in banking before entering Stanbrook in 1981. This totally non-technical background probably explains why she loves designing websites and playing with bits of code and various gadgets. At Stanbrook, she was a Jill of all trades, poultry keeper, cook, and cellarer, bursar. For some years, she was in charge of Stanbrook Abbey Press when she revived some old skills such as printing on handmade paper and introduced some new ones such as electronic publishing. In between times, she saw to the refurbishment of the printing room, translated the rule of St. Benedict. She was a member of the regular Benedicti Studia, taught herself Hebrew, and made gallons of wine. She's a keen gardener and rumored to write poetry in secret, as well as contributing a weekly column to The Universe. She has been prioress since 2004. On her Twitter page, Sister Catherine describes herself as a Benedictine nun, keen on God, books, and technology. Likes people too. The nuns of Holy Trinity prefer to call themselves cloistered rather than enclosed, because the word enclosed may suggest a closed mind. They have a special interest in using contemporary technology to reach out to people who would never otherwise come to the monastery. Whether it is through their wonderful website, designed in HTML5, Dame Catherine's prolific blogs and tweets, or their recently launched virtual retreat program, Dame Catherine and the Sisters of Holy Trinity Monastery exemplify the remarkable ways in which religion and the internet have become deeply intertwined. Please welcome Dame Catherine Wybourne.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'd rather like to meet Superwoman. I'm actually, I must say, a member of the very smallest Benedictine monastery, I think, in the world. We laughingly describe ourselves as two nuns and a dog. And we live in furnished accommodation, which makes us slightly unusual. However, if one takes into account our online community, we can number ourselves in thousands. And unlike the experts who spoke to you this morning, and who will be speaking to you after I've finished, I really have nothing to say to you other than sharing a little of my own experience of using the internet and some of the questions that it has raised in my own mind as, I hope, a person of faith. Now, I have to say that you may not have realized as you came up the stairs and saw that Tim Berners-Lee got the Albert Medal from the RSA in, I think it's 2002, because of course we owe the internet technology to him. But like some of the best things in life, including champagne, Benedictines are in fact responsible for the internet. Because back in the 9th century, we invented the idea of the mortuary roll. When somebody died, we sent a long, long piece of parchment round all the other monasteries in the world saying, Brother Fergus has kicked the bucket, and by the way, we've finished the south transept. And when it got to the next monastery, they would say something like, we've had an election, and guess what? We've got another head of St. John the Baptist. And eventually, these rolls would come back to the monastery that had sent them out, sometimes 100, 120 years after they had originally been sent out. So the idea of communication and of networking is very much in the Benedictine tradition. And the slide that you see up there is not only a shameless piece of self-advertisement, it's an attempt to demonstrate a very simple truth, that a very small monastery with very limited resources can reach out to an astonishing number of people, even when it's lost in deepest Oxfordshire. But how did we get involved? Were we mesmerized by gadgets and technology? Not a bit of it. We live according to a 6th century rule, the rule of St. Benedict. And in that rule, there are 2 chapters that come close together. One is about the oratory of the monastery, the place where we pray. And immediately following it is a chapter about hospitality. If we are open to God, we've got to be open and welcoming to other people. And interestingly, Benedict makes some comparisons between the sacred space of the oratory and the sacred space where we welcome guests. So our website engagement, our internet engagement, began in prayer, seeking God, and seeking to share the little that we have learnt about God with other people. And one of the reasons why we have several websites up there is because we learnt very early on that one website really needs to address one issue if it is to remain clear, comprehensive, and engaging. So, for example, like a lot of people, we have a basic community website, benedictinenuns.org.uk, and there is, of course, a mobile version, benedictinenuns.net. Yes, just wait till I go to Rome and have a word with His Holiness. And in that website, we set out, like so many church websites or religious websites in general, something about ourselves, something about what we are engaged in, and something of our values. In a sense, we identify ourselves. And one of the problems that has always occurred to me is that we can end up talking about ourselves rather than about God and other people. We can become inward-looking. And I have to say, as a Catholic, one of the things that has slightly alarmed me in the last few years is the number of Catholic websites which have become a kind of online ghetto. We talk to other Catholics. If we're conservative Catholics, we talk to other conservative Catholics. If we're liberal Catholics, we talk to other liberal Catholics. Now, occasionally, this coziness is interrupted by the eruption of thoughtful agnostics or atheists, as well as the weird and wacky. And that can be quite interesting. But most of the time, and it wasn't so back in the 1990s, we're talking to ourselves. And one of the things I'd like to throw out this afternoon is that a good thing? Do you notice that in the websites with which you engage? Now, another thing that we do is we blog. One of our blogs has now been laid to rest. It had the name Colophon, and if you listen to the introduction, you might have realized that because it came at the end of our website and told people quite a lot about ourselves, and I had a bit of a printing background, it was the obvious name. And it grew so big and so unwieldy that we thought we've got to put it to sleep. And of course, back in 2008, Wired was telling us that the blog was dead, wasn't it? And we thought to ourselves, well, people are actually accessing blogs in a different way from that in which they were accessing them in the 1990s. Very few people visit a blog daily these days. Very few people, I think, actually use a feed. I mean, when did you last use Google Reader to read a blog of choice? No, I wouldn't mind betting that if you follow a blog at all, you follow it via Twitter or Facebook. That is your primary point of entry to the blogosphere. So we moved one of our blogs to its own standalone address, and I think I must have been slightly mesmerized by the fact that we had just acquired an iPod, because I chose the name ibenedictines.org. I slightly regret that. It's going to age pretty quickly, but it's easy to remember. And we also moved the engine, because you have to think a little bit about this. If you've got a self-hosted blog, as we do, what's the best engine to use? So we use WordPress because it's the most sophisticated. Gives us a great deal of interactivity. And of course, we don't bother to moderate our comments. Well, if something's libelous, or if something's obscene, or if something's really just plain nasty, we'll pull it. If it's nasty about us, we'll let it stand and let our friends defend us. But, that's a kind of moving on. How many church websites in particular still have a horrible 1990s look about them? Rather more than I would care to name here, because I might lose quite a lot of friends. Why is it important that we keep our means of online identification up to date? Quite simply, because the world is moving on. Back in the 16th century, people got terribly worried about printing. Well, the internet is the contemporary equivalent of printing. We've been able to do all this stuff on a very, very modest budget. And as I say there, we've reached 119 countries last month. That's not particularly great, but for 2 nuns and a dog in rural Oxfordshire, with a very small niche market, if you want to use those terms, it's not bad. It's even more interesting when you bore into the statistics and say, whom are we meeting? Because this brings in questions of community. Now, with our online community, there are levels of membership. There are the visitors, there are the friends, there are the associates, and there are the oblates, each of which represents an increasing degree of closeness to the heart of the community, each of which is given greater degrees of access to the monastery. Anyone who likes can email us. We've got plenty of email forms. We've got a private forum just for the use of our oblates because they are closest to us. Our web conferences engage with anyone who wants to. But we also have private video conferences just between ourselves, because even our oblate community is spread over 3 continents. How are we going to meet except in cyberspace? Now this parallels very neatly what we're actually doing in monastic community, because there too there is a progression, and it is what we know of monastic life which determined how we would present ourselves on the internet. You start out as a postulant. Well, you have a very happy life, actually. You don't have to do very much except eat, sleep, and meditate. That's what Benedict says, eat, sleep, and meditate. That's all you've got to do. Then you become a novice, and you dress a bit like me, but with a white veil, and you discover you've got a nasty thing called a novice mistress. But, you're a bit closer to the community. And then you make vows for 3 years, and you've got something called a junior mistress, and life gets a bit harder. And then you make solemn profession, which is for life, and then you give absolutely everything, and there's no going back. So it's a total commitment. And we have deliberately modeled our online engagement and the way in which people relate to us in the online community on our own monastic life, because it makes sense to use what is familiar to you. Now, there is a problem, isn't there? As so many of our speakers have mentioned, the virtual and the real worlds don't always act the same. Yes, we're the same people in the virtual world as we are in the real world, but we tend to view how we use online facilities in a slightly different way. We'll say things in response to blogs that I certainly hope no one would ever say to another person's face. We will make comments on serious subjects that perhaps should not be made. We can revel in the anonymity that the blogs, that the internet gives us. But it's not all bad. We can also react very quickly, for good or ill. You know, there's an immediacy about it. That, I think, is sometimes a positive thing, sometimes not so positive. We can also live in the virtual world so much that we actually become absent from the real world. Now, when I bore into the statistics of some of the people that use our website, when they allow me to do so, obviously, I find it very interesting that we have approximately equal numbers of male and female users. That doesn't often happen in monasteries of women. When we launched our online retreat service, I was fascinated to find we had 80 people signing up in the first 10 days, of whom 40% were men. Now that is telling me something about male spirituality I honestly didn't know, because quite frankly, being penned up in an ordinary retreat with a whole load of middle-aged women is not an inviting prospect, even if you're a middle-aged woman like me. So that was our first shock, that we had much more engagement with men than we were expecting. Our second shock was realizing how important engagement with us as a faith community was to the people who were interacting with us. I think approximately 50% of the people who interact with us are single or widowed or separated, or feel that in some way the relationships in their life are not very fulfilling. And of course we have an email prayer line and sort of live chat facilities so that people can get in touch with us on a very private and very personal level. And it's very interesting to me, at any rate, that a lot of people who are clearly searching for something feel that they can unburden themselves through the anonymity or virtual anonymity that the internet gives, who would not go along to their local clergyman or rabbi or whatever. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not prepared to say, because I think we haven't really had enough experience to know whether it's going to be, in the long term, an advantage or not. At least these are people who are engaging. We also have a lot of people who say, I don't really believe anything, but I'm interested enough to come and interact with you because you have provided a safe and friendly environment in which I can do so. Now, we get neurotic, don't we, about our own personal safety. You know, I don't want you to know about my credit card. I don't want you to know my date of birth because ID theft is always a problem. It is amazing how much people are prepared to share about themselves. And I'm not talking about younger people on Facebook, where I think very often that's a question of not really having had too much bad experience of the world to know that sometimes it is wise to be a bit private. No, I am talking about people who almost treat us as a confessional. And that's quite a lot to handle on the receiving end. But it's interesting. Create the right sort of safe space where people can engage, and we will do something that is useful. There is, however, absolutely no substitute for face-to-face engagement. I don't want a virtual God, I want a real God. That's something I often say to people. I don't want a virtual community, I want a real community. Because only a real God and a real community will actually enable me to grow. Why? Because you can't escape them. You know, I learned much more about Buddhism during the year when the Dalai Lama asked two Tibetan Buddhist monks if they could live in our community than I have done in a lifetime of reading about Buddhism. There is something about standing at the kitchen sink and doing the washing up which will teach one something that no amount of philosophizing in the parlor is going to do. And if one lives with somebody for a year, you can't hide anything, good or bad. So, you know, you can put on a wonderful public front. It's the private front that really engages and communicates faith. And I don't believe for one moment that we can really do that online. So, in a way, I am underlining some of the things that we said this morning about the virtual space being a little bit inadequate. It is, however, much better than nothing. And I think the number of lonely people, the number of people who are stuck in unapproachable areas who can engage through the internet need to be thought about. Again, an anecdote. I was very surprised when one of the people doing our online retreat sent me an email saying, I am so pleased about this. I am halfway up a Japanese mountain and I can't get down it. And I thought, yes, I think having lived abroad myself, I know what it is like to have somebody speaking with one's own accent, from one's own faith tradition, and to be able to engage with them with an immediacy that one can't if one's stuck halfway up a mountain. It doesn't have to be in Japan, it could be anywhere. So yes. But aren't there a few problems with all this? I mentioned the fact that I thought that we are very good at identifying ourselves and putting out our wares, as it were. I think we're still a bit at the didactic stage. It's amazing how many church websites in particular have gone on from a little bit about St. Cuthbert's to the vicar's podcast sermons. And you think, well, yeah, I don't want to hear it a second time, thank you. It was bad enough the first. We've done a little bit of that, I must admit, because we've done a lot of podcasts and videos. But in our case, it was slightly different. Got the community together, all three of us then, and the oldest nun, who was 79, was told, Dame, you've got so much to offer, and we'd like you to offer it before you die, so please, would you start podcasting? And she sort of went, well, I don't think much of this, you know, I'm pre-internet, pre-silicon chip. But she's produced some of the most wonderful podcasts and a few videos, which we shall treasure forever, because she belongs to a generation who approach the world rather differently from the way that we do. And her experience of being a Catholic, first in Trinidad, then in England, of being a nun before the Second Vatican Council and subsequently, is a witness that we are losing. And I think if we think about the role that the internet can play in handing on tradition, that is very valuable. Now, obviously, I'm very sensitive to that because, as I say, I live by a 6th century rule, and everybody who is a Benedictine has received this habit from a previous generation. So we've got an unbroken tradition. You know, you don't just put this on yourself. I value that handing on of tradition. Not everybody will. And we heard this morning that in the mega churches, for example, it is those with a modern, dynamic, approach to liturgy and so forth that are, in America, attracting new recruits. Sometimes in Europe, I think the reverse is true. We have, certainly in the Catholic Church, a neoconservative development, particularly among young people, which is creating some quite interesting conditions. The liberals who are now in their 60s and 70s are saying, what's got into the young people today? And the young people today are rediscovering a tradition that we've always had, but perhaps haven't been too grand about passing on. So that's another point. You know, how do we handle tradition in our online engagement? Is it valuable, or is it something which is a hindrance? I don't want to preempt anything that's going to be said this afternoon, how can I, about extremism. But one of the things that I have noticed is a greater degree of polarization in opinion. Now, the good side of the internet is that it's given everyone a voice. And coming as I do from a church which is very clearly hierarchical and with a well-deserved reputation for control, I, as a woman, particularly appreciate that. Because how would I, for example, ever be allowed to express an opinion except to my dear sister in Christ? Because I have absolutely no status in the church, I have no role, I'm just a nun. And because I am a cloistered nun, the chances of you running into me are pretty minimal. But not just me. A lot of people now have become instant experts. Opinion, comment is free. Isn't that the Guardian's tagline? Comment is free. Everyone can express an opinion, and therefore we have a different problem, which is how do we assess the veracity or the worth of the opinions which are expressed? Now, occasionally I find myself getting frightfully Catholic when people launch forth into the internet saying the Catholic Church teaches this or that, and I think, absolute rot. Take a walk around the garden to cool down, and then do my best to say what the Catholic Church actually does teach. Because we all, whatever faith tradition we come from, have a responsibility to do our homework. When people's access to information is very largely going to be dominated by how the search engines locate and find it, we cannot be sure that what we are reading is actually honest and true and accurate. So if we're going to express our opinion on blogs, Facebook, even if we're going to tweet it in 140 characters, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we have found out the basis on which we are tweeting, blogging, or Facebooking. Talking of Facebook and Twitter reminds me that a lot of people still seem to think that they're a bit of a waste of time. And people say, well, yes, I know that if you can't manage a website, you can put up a Facebook page and people can comment and can engage. And that's the place to be. Well, we came quite late to Facebook, and quite intentionally, actually, because we didn't like the way that Facebook uses the word friend. One thing the internet is doing, I think we could say without disagreement, it is changing our use of language, and it is changing the way in which we read. Now, because I also design websites as well as surf them, I know that the average attention span on a page is 15 seconds. The fact that it's the same as a goldfish is perhaps not accidental. Okay, so we've got 15 seconds to engage attention, to engage with the message. Now, perhaps I'm just unlucky, but I often find when I'm on Facebook I haven't got time to go through the froth to get to the serious stuff underneath. And I take my veil off, as it were, to those people who can do it. So I freely acknowledge we're no good at it. Twitter appeals to me, on the other hand, because although I'm waffling on, I really like it when people keep things short. And if you can't say something worthwhile in 140 characters, my experience is that you might not say very much that's worthwhile in 140 pages. Particularly if you happen to be a churchy person, because we are all far too wordy. I'm beginning to wonder whether I haven't run out of time, have I? Yes, I have. Right. So you see, the sins I condemn in others, I must condemn in myself. Thank you for listening.